He thought he had it all planned. The charts, the slogans, the cold precision of a polished talking point on immigration. Senator J.D. Vance stepped onto that stage expecting applause. But what he didn't expect was silence. A silence so sharp it cut through the noise of politics. A pause that made the entire nation lean forward. And then came one line, delivered without anger, without theatrics, just clarity. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rehearsed, but it changed everything. In a single moment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't just dismantle an argument, she exposed the cost of forgetting our humanity. This is the story of that night, of how a televised debate became something no one could unsee, of how one question echoed far beyond the studio lights and into the hearts of veterans, teachers, and families who had stopped believing Washington could feel. The email subject line was only 5 words. Confirmed. Vance versus Ocasio-Cortez. No exclamation mark, no fluff, just a cold, factual statement, like a challenge slid across the table in a silent room. In a nondescript glass conference room inside a TV network's Manhattan office, producers leaned in toward the glowing screen as the final deal locked in. A primetime special, live, no edits, no breaks, 1 hour, 2 podiums, 1 topic, immigration reform. The network executives loved it. J.D. Vance, calm, calculated, a best-selling author turned senator, was already crafting zingers. His team leaked phrases like moral clarity and border sanity to favored outlets. He would stand as the voice of America's forgotten towns, they said. Finally, one producer whispered, someone who can out-talk her. And then, somewhere in a congressional basement, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez read the same subject line on her iPad. She stared at it for a long time, not because she was surprised, but because she knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just a debate, it was bait. Behind her, a junior staffer entered the room, awkward, hesitant. They confirmed? AOC didn't turn around. They confirmed. The staffer exhaled slowly. JD's team is going to be brutal. He'll interrupt. He'll try to make it emotional. They'll cut clips to make you look angry, she finished calmly. The room fell quiet. Another aide chimed in, less gentle. This isn't a hearing. It's theater. And they cast you as the villain. AOC finally looked up. Her eyes didn't blink. Then let's rewrite the script. They expected her to decline. Truthfully, she considered it, not because she was afraid to face J.D. Vance, but because she knew how they'd frame it. She'd be the radical, the over-emotional woman of color. He'd be the measured voice of reason, standing behind talking points wrapped in concern. But there was something they didn't know, something only a few people closest to her understood. For the past 2 nights, she hadn't slept well, not because of policy memos or political pressure, but because of a small voice replaying in her head, one she couldn't forget. 3 days earlier, in a detention center outside McAllen, Texas, a little boy had held her wrist tightly and whispered, "Do you know where my mom went?" She had no answer, and the silence between them was louder than any speech she'd ever given. Now they were giving her a microphone again. The morning after the confirmation, J.D. Vance appeared on national radio. "She's quick, sure," he said with a chuckle, "but emotion doesn't solve policy." He paused, just long enough for the host to jump in. "So you're saying she's all passion, no plan?" "I'm saying she's great at lighting fires. I'm here to put them out." The soundbite went viral. Conservative media praised his poise. Fundraising emails rolled out before noon. The headline, J.D. Vance, standing strong against chaos. Back in her office, AOC read it aloud, then folded the paper. She looked at her staffers and said quietly, "They think I'll show up to fight." Her voice lowered. "I'm showing up to ask a question." The team exchanged looks, confused. One finally asked, "What question?" A small smile flickered. "You'll know it when I ask it." In a small living room outside Dayton, Ohio, the television remote sat untouched on the armrest of a worn recliner. Beside it, a photograph in a simple wooden frame showed 2 young Marines standing in front of a dusty Humvee, sun glaring off their helmets. One of them was still here, retired, walking with a cane, divorced and uncertain whether the country he fought for still remembered what it was fighting for. Frank didn't care much for politics anymore. He had voted Republican most of his life, but lately it all felt like static, loud, directionless, and uninterested in men like him. He wasn't watching the upcoming debate out of curiosity. He was watching because he had a son, somewhere out west, who hadn't spoken to him in 6 months. The last words they shared were about immigration. "Dad, you don't know what it's like down here." Frank had scoffed. "And you think she does?" He had shot back, meaning AOC. But tonight, as he waited for the broadcast to start, the volume already turned up. He found himself wondering, not just what they'd say, but whether anyone would say something that didn't feel rehearsed. Hundreds of miles south in El Paso, Texas, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the break room of a hospital's night shift. Anna had worked 14 hours straight, no time for food, barely time for breath. She sat now with a microwave tamale and her badge still clipped to her scrubs. She wasn't supposed to be watching, but the nurse on duty before her had left the screen on, and something in her gut told her not to turn away. Anna's aunt had disappeared last spring after crossing the border. No phone call, no name on a list. Just vanished into a system designed to forget. Anna filed a report, searched shelters, even called ICE anonymously. Nothing. She didn't know if watching a televised argument would help, but she was tired of no one saying her name. Her aunt deserved someone who would say her name. She didn't trust J.D. Vance. He reminded her of the men who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. AOC? She wasn't sure. Too polished, maybe. Too idealistic. But there was something in the way AOC didn't flinch when people yelled at her that Anna couldn't ignore. It reminded her of the way nurses learn to speak calmly over the sound of heart monitors screaming. And then far from the southern heat, in a cozy bungalow near Sarasota, Florida, Betty May rearranged the pillows on her floral couch and turned the dial to just the right volume. Loud enough to hear, not so loud it'd wake her cat. She had been a registered Republican since Reagan and still carried a quiet pride in her flag pin, though she hadn't worn it in years. She didn't like the shouting, didn't like the cruelty that passed for leadership now, and she especially didn't like that her grandson hadn't visited since she told him children were being held in cages. "He said I was watching too much MSNBC, she murmured, pressing her teacup to her lips. She wasn't expecting to agree with AOC, but part of her hoped someone would say something decent tonight. Something true, something her grandson might watch and think, maybe Grandma's not crazy after all. 3 different living rooms, 3 different lives, and yet each of them, in their own way, was tuning in not for policy, but for something harder to define. A glimpse of honesty, a moment of grace, or maybe, just maybe, a pause in the noise long enough to feel something again. The countdown had begun, and none of them could shake the feeling. This night would be different. The green room smelled like hairspray and stress. Bright studio lights leaked in through the half-closed door, flickering against the gray walls like distant lightning. Inside, 2 separate energies occupied the same space. One loud, confident, rehearsed, the other quiet, still listening for something deeper. J.D. Vance leaned back in a cushioned swivel chair, suit crisp, tie angled just right. He chuckled with a producer about poll numbers and made a casual swipe at how emotional she always gets. His communications director handed him a last-minute cue card labeled "Border Control equals National Identity" in bold. "Just stick to the framework," someone muttered. J.D. nodded. He wasn't worried. The show was structured, the lighting was flattering, and the audience, at least in his mind, was already leaning in his direction. AOC sat across the room, separated by a divider, but in another world entirely. No makeup chatter, no nervous pacing, just her, hunched slightly forward, elbows on her knees, reading a small folded piece of paper with careful slowness. It was written in thick, uneven handwriting, the kind only children or people in crisis have. One line repeated twice. "They took her. I don't know where she went." The note had been slipped into her hand 2 weeks ago by a child during a brief visit to a migrant shelter. The child hadn't spoken, just passed the letter, then stepped back behind the fence like a ghost disappearing into fog. AOC hadn't shown anyone the letter, but tonight it lived in her jacket pocket, close enough to feel. Her chief of staff bent down next to her. "Alex, look, this isn't the House floor. This is TV. They'll interrupt. He'll bait you. Don't give them the clip they want." Another aide chimed in, worried. "Just be firm, but don't explode, okay?" She kept her eyes on the letter. A pause stretched long. Then her voice, quiet but unwavering. "I won't shout." She folded the paper once more, slowly, deliberately, and slipped it back into her jacket. Then she looked up. "I'll wait." The control room buzzed. Countdown clocks blinked in red. Stagehands whispered final checks through earpieces. Microphones were clipped, jackets adjusted, hair retouched. The moderator, a polished face with practiced neutrality, stood in front of the glossy debate stage, nodding through last-second updates from the control booth. JD stood and gave his sleeves a sharp tug. One last deep breath. He practiced his opening line under his breath. "We can't have a country without a border." Across from him, AOC walked onto the set with slow, steady steps, eyes fixed on the empty podium ahead. She didn't rehearse lines. She didn't carry cue cards. What she carried weighed more than that. Backstage, a junior producer whispered into her headset, "Okay, we're live in 30, 29, 28. In the hallway behind the stage, a staffer watched the monitor nervously, holding their breath. Another, gripping a clipboard, whispered, "She's going to be fine, right?" No one answered. No one needed to. Back on stage, JD shifted his stance slightly, already smiling. AOC rolled her shoulders back, not smiling at all. And then came the voice from the control room, calm but electric, slicing through the tension. "We go live in 3, 2. The screen faded to black for just half a second. Then the lights came on. The studio lights settled into a soft but unforgiving glow. The backdrop behind the podiums displayed an abstract American flag, bold reds, deep blues, and stars that seemed to pulse with anticipation. From millions of screens across the country, eyes waited. For some, it was entertainment. For others, confirmation. And for a quieter few, it was the desperate hope that someone might finally say what they had been carrying in silence. The moderator turned toward J.D. Vance first. He smiled, not forced, not warm, but precise, calculated. His voice came through steady and rehearsed. "We are a nation of laws, not emotion," he began. It wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration of control. J.D. continued, painting the southern border not as a crossing, but a breach. He spoke in numbers. 84,000 illegal crossings per month, 73% increase in unaccompanied minors, billions spent on housing and processing. The figures rolled out like ammunition from a prepared chamber, each one designed to sound like chaos wrapped in math. Then came the imagery. He mentioned floodgates, criminal exploitation, vulnerable Americans forced to compete for resources. Each phrase chosen not for accuracy, but for resonance. He didn't name any families. He didn't describe any children. He described flows, crisis centers, unsustainable burdens. Fear as policy, wrapped in civility. He ended with a clean pivot back to principle. We can't afford compassion without control. And we cannot have sovereignty without consequence. A few audience members applauded softly. In living rooms across the country, some nodded, some frowned, and some held their breath. The moderator turned toward the other podium. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, your opening statement?" AOC didn't move right away. She looked down briefly, then up, straight into the camera, not at her opponent. Her voice was calm, measured, but no less deliberate. "We are also a nation of families," she said, "and some laws are written in cruelty. No script, no fire, just a stillness that felt like defiance. Like a mother choosing her words before she speaks to a frightened child. Not to soothe, but to tell the truth." She didn't name statistics. She named people. A father who dropped his daughter's hand to be processed and never saw her again. A 9-year-old who slept under aluminum blankets for 46 nights. A grandmother who was deported after showing up to court, on time, with papers, because the address had changed without notice. "These aren't threats," she said quietly. They are stories, and they are ours now, whether we look or not. JD shifted slightly. She hadn't addressed him. She hadn't even looked at him. That somehow was more unsettling than if she had. We speak of laws like they're sacred, she continued, but laws are written by people, and people are capable of error, of cruelty, of choosing silence when they're afraid of empathy. A beat of pause, not long, but intentional. I do not stand here tonight to justify breaking the law, she said. I stand here because some laws break people. No applause, no need. Her words landed heavier than claps. In the control room, a producer whispered, "That wasn't her opening." That was her aim. From Ohio to Texas to Florida, 3 viewers leaned forward, not because they agreed or disagreed, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had said something that didn't feel safe. Just true. J.D. Vance leaned slightly forward, one hand gripping the edge of the podium as if preparing to pull the conversation onto his turf. His tone sharpened, not overtly hostile, but edged with the condescension of someone who felt certain the next move would corner his opponent. "So let me ask you directly, Congresswoman," he said, turning his body halfway toward her for the first time. "Are you saying we should have open borders?" A murmur fluttered through the live audience. Not gasps, but a sharp inhale of expectation. In control rooms across the country, producers leaned forward slightly. They knew this pattern. Force the frame, watch the opponent either squirm or snap. It had worked before. AOC didn't blink. She didn't take the bait. Instead, she stepped away from the abstraction entirely. "There was a woman," she began, her voice level, almost quiet, "in Ciudad Juarez who'd been hiding from the cartel for weeks. She and her daughter, 5 years old, had moved house 3 times in 2 months. Every time someone knocked, the little girl would crawl under the table and cover her ears." The studio air shifted. JD blinked but didn't interrupt. Yet. One night after a neighbor was shot, she made a choice. She didn't call it illegal. She didn't call it brave. She just called it survival. She packed a backpack with a water bottle, 2 granola bars, and her daughter's toy giraffe. Then she ran. JD adjusted his mic, preparing his interruption. "She made it across," AOC continued, "turned herself in, asked for asylum, followed the rules as she understood them. She begged them not to separate her from her daughter." She looked up, but not at JD. "They did it anyway." JD pounced. "And how many times," he cut in, "do we hear stories that pull at the heartstrings while ignoring the consequences?" "Congresswoman, what you're describing is tragic. But if we turn every tragedy into a loophole, we no longer have a border. We have chaos." Polite applause came from a corner of the audience. Clearly, JD's invited guests or sympathizers. He smiled tightly. His words were crafted, polished for sound bites. Loophole, chaos, heartstrings. But AOC didn't respond right away. She didn't fight back. She let the noise settle, like a teacher waiting for a restless classroom to calm not with volume, but with stillness. "I'm not arguing for loopholes," she said finally. "I'm arguing for memory." JD raised a brow. She turned back to the camera. "Because we seem to have forgotten that asylum is legal. We seem to forget that border security doesn't mean separating a child from the only person keeping her sane. And we seem to forget that cruelty isn't a plan. It's a warning to anyone else thinking of asking for help." JD looked straight ahead, jaw tense. AOC added one more line, softer than before. "If your child were in that same position, would you call her a loophole?" He didn't answer. Not yet. And in that pause, brief, taut, stretching longer than it should have, people across the country felt something shift. Not because of a policy, not even because of a story, but because the room had been baited with fear, and AOC had answered with something more dangerous than anger. She had answered with grief, and grief, when spoken plainly, doesn't shout. It lingers. J.D. Vance smiled like a man who believed he had just sealed the deal. He straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders, and delivered the line he'd been holding since rehearsal. The line crafted not for truth, but for television. Not for policy, but for dominance. "This isn't about kids," he said, pausing just long enough to ensure the tension snapped. "It's about control." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Not full-on applause, but the kind of chuckle that signals approval, the kind that turns politics into performance. Somewhere backstage, a junior staffer probably marked the moment for clipping. It was clean, usable, made for Twitter. The moderator didn't challenge it. He glanced at the clock, shuffled his notes, and offered the next question to the floor like tossing a bone. But the room was already tilting. JD had the momentum now, or so he thought. Across the stage, AOC didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She leaned forward slowly, resting her fingertips on the edge of the podium as if grounding herself. Her eyes locked on a distant point, not at JD, but somewhere just beyond the lens of the camera. Somewhere in the spaces between policy papers and missing persons reports. Somewhere people like him never bothered to look. Her voice didn't rise. In fact, it softened. And in that softening, the air changed. He says it's about control, she said. But control of what? Of whom? She didn't elaborate, not yet. She let the questions hang there, unfinished, unanswered, echoing like a bell someone had struck just once. JD chuckled again, under his breath this time. The smirk returned. He thought she was hesitating, but inside her mind, it was something different entirely. They think silence means surrender, she thought. But silence sharpens the question. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, like a sculptor pausing before the final cut. She scanned the room, not just the stage, but the audience, the cameras, the lights, the millions of unseen eyes watching from living rooms, hospital lounges, barracks. People who had heard 100 statistics, 1,000 slogans, but maybe, just maybe, were waiting for something real. And so she didn't answer JD's line. She let it sit. She let the silence work on the room. Because what do you say to someone who's weaponized children as a rhetorical afterthought? What do you say to someone who smiles while talking about loss like it's a policy cost? You don't shout. You don't beg. You wait. And when the room gets quiet enough, when even the moderator notices the shift in energy, you let the truth walk in on its own feet. She looked up again. Not at JD, but at the people he'd tried to erase with a smirk, and said only this: "We'll come back to that. No drama, no fireworks, just a promise." And across the country, in homes where the laughter hadn't reached, in spaces where people held back tears they'd never been able to explain, something unexpected happened. They didn't change the channel. They leaned in, because somewhere deep inside, they could feel it. The question hadn't been asked yet, but it was coming. J.D. Vance finished his segment like a man closing a deal. His voice had swelled with just the right gravity. His hand gestures landed exactly where the media consultants had coached them to. The final line, "We cannot keep bending the law every time someone cries on television," drew a small but audible round of applause from part of the audience. He nodded slightly, a practiced gesture of humility cloaking victory. He was done, or so he thought. The moderator turned toward the second podium, unaware that the most unforgettable moment of the night was about to come from not what would be said, but from what would not. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," he prompted, voice level, unaware that the clock had already started ticking in a very different direction. AOC looked into the camera, not at the moderator, not at JD, just directly into the lens, and said nothing. 5 seconds passed. That's enough time, on television, for a producer to panic. 10 seconds passed. That's enough time for commentators to start typing reactions. 15 seconds. Somewhere in the audience, someone coughed. J.D. Vance shifted in his seat and tried not to look uncertain. He smiled again, though now less like a man in control, more like a man wondering if he was still part of the scene. Still, she didn't speak. 20 seconds. No expression, no movement, no apology, only stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for attention, but commands it. And then finally she spoke. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't stumble, it didn't fill the air. It entered it. "You ever notice," she began, her tone measured, nearly a whisper, "how silence makes people uncomfortable?" JD glanced toward her, his brow knitting. "But do you know what's more uncomfortable?" she continued. "A mother screaming at a closed steel door, Because someone told her the law requires it. There were no statistics, no index cards, just the weight of the words themselves. She paused again, this time not in hesitation, but in deliberate pacing, and then added, I stayed quiet because I needed you to feel something, not fear, not control, but the absence. She turned her head slightly, not to JD, but to the audience watching from home. Her voice grew softer, not weaker. I needed you to feel what it's like when someone you love disappears behind a system. When all you get is silence. No call, no name, no update. Just gone. And then after a moment, that's what we've legalized. The studio was still. Even the moderator forgot to check the clock. She kept going, not louder, but deeper. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. I care if you've ever waited by a phone that didn't ring. I care if you've ever lost someone to a policy that treated them like a number instead of a name. And I care if you've ever told yourself, it's not my problem, just to sleep through the night. JD tried to clear his throat, tried to interrupt, but the moderator, surprisingly, held up his hand. Not now, because something was happening that even he knew better than to cut short. AOC didn't break eye contact with the camera. There's a reason I started with silence, she said. It's the only language this country seems to understand when we talk about the people it's trying hardest to forget. And with that, she stepped back slightly from the mic. She wasn't finished. But for the first time all night, no one rushed to respond. Even JD Vance, his applause line now forgotten, sat still, unsure of what terrain he was standing on anymore. There was no change in her tone, no rise in volume, no shift in posture. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez simply looked into the camera, eyes steady, voice low, and asked the question that peeled the room open. If that was your son, pulled from your wife's arms, screaming, would you call that policy, or would you call it a crime? The air changed, not metaphorically, tangibly, like pressure had dropped in the room. A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. One man in the back muttered something under his breath that even he didn't finish. Somewhere in the control booth, a producer's hand froze above the cut to wide button. The sound guy turned instinctively toward the stage like he wasn't just hearing it, but feeling it. Even the moderator, who had trained for years to stay neutral, looked up too quickly, blinking harder than he should have. JD Vance sat still for a heartbeat longer than the cameras would forgive. His face faltered. Not entirely, not enough to break him, but enough to reveal him. The corner of his mouth twitched. His eyes darted. Not at her, not at the camera, but somewhere sideways, searching for solid ground. Then came the words, shaky and thin. That's not what this is about. But even he didn't believe them. The camera zoomed tighter, instinctively drawn by the silence that followed. It found his face just as the last trace of that rehearsed smile slipped away. What remained wasn't outrage or authority. It was something smaller, like a man realizing too late that he'd stepped into something real. AOC didn't press. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even blink. She just let the question hang. Your son, your wife, screaming, and let it do what statistics never could. Because this time, it wasn't some anonymous story from the border. It wasn't a policy paper. It was his hypothetical child, his imagined grief, and the audience felt it. So did the homes across the country where people had grown numb from arguments that never touched them. But now, this wasn't policy. This was personal. In Ohio, Frank, the retired Marine, sat forward in his chair, fingers tightening on the armrest. In El Paso, Anna stopped chewing, her tray going cold in her lap. In Florida, Betty May turned the volume higher, as if needing to be absolutely sure she had heard right. The debate didn't move for a full 10 seconds. No one filled the space. Even the moderator failed to jump in. Because when a question pierces deep enough, the only honest response is silence. JD finally found his footing, or tried to. I don't appreciate being emotionally blackmailed, he said, with a small scoff that barely carried. But it was too late. The room had cracked open, and once cracked, it doesn't go back. AOC gave no reply. She didn't need one. She simply turned back to the moderator and gently said, "I yield my time." The words landed like a gavel, quiet but final. And from that moment on, the debate was no longer about talking points, no longer about who sounded stronger or smarter. It was about who had dared to ask the question no one wanted to answer, and who had to live with not answering it. In Ohio, Frank's hand hovered midair, his beer bottle untouched. The bubbles inside stilled, as if the carbonation itself had gone quiet. His eyes stayed locked on the screen. That one line, "Would you call it a crime?" kept ringing in his ears like a question he hadn't asked himself in years. Not since Fallujah. Not since that moment when orders had collided with humanity and the gray had won. Now, for the first time in a long time, someone on TV wasn't talking past him. She was talking into the part of him that still hadn't healed. And she wasn't shouting. She was just asking. In El Paso, Anna reached up and wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand, quick and quiet like someone trained not to let softness show. The break room had fallen silent. Even the humming vending machine seemed to fade. That line, "If that was your son," had hit too close. Because once, not long ago, her cousin had called from a detention center, his voice trembling over a bad signal. "They took her, Anna. I don't know where she is." No camera had captured that scream. No one had televised that moment. But tonight, someone had finally named it. Not as policy, as pain. And in Florida, Betty May, in her soft pink sweater and tidy living room, clutched the edge of the crocheted blanket draped over her knees. Her tea had gone cold, untouched. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Oh my God." It wasn't the words. It was the way AOC said them. With restraint, not rage. With dignity, not drama. It reminded Betty of sermons long ago, when the preacher didn't need to yell to shake the room. She felt herself sitting straighter. She didn't agree with everything AOC stood for, but in that moment, she wasn't thinking about party lines. She was thinking about decency. Back in the studio, J.D. Vance shifted again, trying to summon control that was slipping faster than he could reframe it. His mouth opened before his judgment caught up. "That's emotional manipulation," he said, the edge of a scoff coating each syllable. It landed flat. A few polite claps, a few coughs, mostly a wave of discomfort. AOC turned, finally looking at him, not as an opponent, but as a man who had just mistaken vulnerability for weakness. Her voice is still calm, still grounded, cut through the noise. "No, that's empathy," she said. "Look it up." The moderator blinked. JD blinked. Viewers across the country blinked. Because in an age of shouting, the line hit, not because it was loud, but because it was exact, surgical, unapologetic. And it didn't just respond, it taught. In a studio control room, a producer whispered to no one in particular, "That's the clip." And across the country, it began to move. 1 second, it was just a moment on air. The next, it was a spark, a ripple, a reckoning. Frank slowly reached for his phone. Anna opened a new message and began typing through blurred eyes. Betty May, usually quiet online, opened Facebook and began to write something she never thought she would post. "I don't agree with everything she says, but tonight, AOC spoke for me." The debate wasn't over, but the balance had shifted, and now it was no longer about who could win the argument. It was about who had dared to feel something real and refused to apologize for it. It started with a single clip, 22 seconds long. No flashy graphics, no music, just a still camera, a quiet voice, and a line that cracked something open. "If that was your son, would you call that policy or would you call it a crime?" Within 6 minutes, it had jumped from a trending debate hashtag into a digital firestorm. On Twitter, the first to catch it wasn't a major pundit or politician. It was a trauma nurse in Colorado who simply tweeted, "I've worked in emergency rooms for 14 years. That's not manipulation. That's what pain sounds like when it finally gets a mic." Her tweet was reposted 30,000 times in under an hour. By the 7th minute, hashtag policy or crime was trending number 3 nationwide. By minute 10, it was number 1. On YouTube, the debate was still streaming, but someone had already clipped the exchange and uploaded it with a title that said everything. The moment J.D. Vance lost control and AOC took over the room. Within an hour, the thumbnail had been clicked more than 400,000 times. On MSNBC, producers scrambled to rearrange the post-debate segment. A host blinked as they rewatched the clip, then turned to the camera and said, "I've never seen a room go from smug to silent that fast." Meanwhile, over at Fox News, the moment was played with a very different banner. AOC uses migrant child to shame America. Again. But even as they tried to redirect the framing, the clip refused to bend. Because it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. And that was the problem. It wasn't supposed to work without shouting. AOC's team didn't need to say anything. They didn't release a statement. They didn't repost the clip. They just watched it move. Her inbox, usually flooded with scheduling requests and policy updates, began to shift. A trickle of emails became a flood. Subject lines read, "I'm 76. I've never cried during a debate. Until now." That line, it brought back a memory I thought I buried. "I'm not even your constituent, but thank you." Of course, not all of it was praise. With virality comes venom. "You're an emotional terrorist," one message read. "Shame on you for manipulating people with fake compassion." But the difference was this time, even the hate sounded defensive. Like they were trying to claw something back they didn't want to admit had hit them. In the back end of her account, her staffers watched the engagement graph spike like a heartbeat. Reddit threads exploded. TikTok edits appeared within minutes. One featured footage of immigrant children overlaid with her line, followed by a simple caption, "This is what truth sounds like." Even members of Congress, those who rarely commented on debates, started quietly reposting the clip. Some added just a single word, "Watch." And perhaps most striking of all, a few conservative-leaning veterans groups shared it too. Not to endorse, not to politicize, just to ask. What would you call it? In an age built on outrage and algorithm, no one expected a question to go viral. But this one did, because it didn't demand loyalty. It demanded humanity. And somehow in 6 minutes, millions of Americans remembered that policy isn't just a platform. It's something that touches a pulse, a home, a child. And when someone finally names the cost out loud, it doesn't echo. It spreads. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, J.D. Vance tore off his microphone with a sharp flick of the wrist. A production assistant flinched as the cable snapped back and nearly hit the floor. J.D. didn't stop. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, fast and clipped. His expression a tangle of frustration and disbelief. Someone behind him muttered, "Senator, we'll need you for post-show." But he waved it off like swatting at smoke. "That was low," he snapped to no one in particular. "That wasn't a debate. That was a trap." He didn't stop walking. A producer tried to catch up with a clipboard and talking points. "Senator, if you'd like to do a quick response for the post feed, maybe counter the empathy narrative." J.D. didn't even look at him. "Let the clip speak for itself," he said sharply, though his voice faltered on the last word. Behind the set walls, tucked away from the hum of post-show chaos, AOC sat alone on a simple folding chair in the corner of the green room. The applause was gone. The tension had drained. But the air still held something. It hadn't settled, just shifted. Her blazer was unbuttoned now. Her notes, barely touched during the debate, sat in her lap. She wasn't reading them. She was looking through them, past them, into a space only she could see. A young staffer poked her head in quietly. "They're asking if you want to join the panel wrap-up." AOC shook her head gently. "Let them talk," she said. "They'll fill the silence with something." The staffer hesitated, then stepped inside. She couldn't have been older than 23, the kind of intern who had memorized every floor plan of the Capitol, but still got nervous making eye contact. She stood there a second, unsure if she should say what she'd been holding. I just wanted to say," she began, then stopped herself, then tried again. "You just changed something out there." AOC smiled faintly, not with pride but with understanding. She reached into her inside pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper, the letter from the child in the shelter. She ran her thumb gently over the creases as if tracing a scar. "I didn't plan the question," she said, almost like a confession. "It was already there." The intern sat down in the chair across from her, like she didn't want to disturb the space, but also didn't want to leave it. After a long moment, she asked, How did you know when to say it? AOC looked up slowly. Her eyes were tired now, but not heavy. Because he smiled. The intern blinked. Smiled? AOC nodded. When he said it wasn't about kids. When he smirked. That's when I knew I couldn't match him in logic. I had to make people feel what he was laughing away. Another silence followed. But it wasn't tense. It was the kind that lets people breathe. In the hallway, campaign consultants buzzed on their phones. In the newsroom, analysts debated impact and strategy. In millions of homes, clips were still being replayed. But in this quiet backstage corner, it wasn't about the numbers. It was about a girl in a shelter, a Marine with a heavy heart, a grandmother with a quiet voice, and an intern who had just seen, for the first time, that truth didn't need volume to break the room. It just needed timing, and someone brave enough not to look away when it arrived. In Dayton, Ohio, Frank sat on the edge of his recliner, the room lit only by the glow of the paused TV screen. The clip had stopped at the exact moment AOC's face softened, just after the question, "Would you call it a crime?" hung in the air like a verdict waiting to land. His thumb hovered over the remote, but he wasn't ready to hit play again. Not yet. His eyes drifted toward the photograph on the bookshelf. Him in uniform. His daughter on his shoulders, no more than 5. He remembered the day it was taken, how she'd cried when he left again 3 weeks later, how he'd promised he'd never be gone too long. And now she lived on the other side of the country, barely called. Their last conversation had ended in shouting, something about media lies and heartstrings politics. He'd slammed the phone down, convinced she just didn't get it. But now, he wasn't so sure. He picked up his phone slowly, as if it were heavier than usual. His fingers hesitated before tapping her name. When she answered, her voice was cautious. "Dad?" There was a beat of silence. "I've been wrong," he said quietly. "About her. About all of it. Maybe." Another pause. Then her voice cracked. "Me too." In El Paso, Anna sat at her kitchen table, the night shift behind her, fatigue resting on her like a second skin. The living room was dark except for the blue light of her laptop, and the screen glowed with a blank document. She'd never written to Congress before, never thought anyone cared. But something about the way AOC had framed that question, not as a partisan weapon, but as a human reckoning, had opened a door Anna didn't realize was still waiting to be unlocked. She didn't write it like a complaint. She wrote it like a memory. She told them about her aunt, about the silence, about the way officials looked through her, not at her. She included the line from the debate, word for word, and then added her own. "We don't need louder leaders. We need leaders who listen to what isn't being said." She saved the letter, took a breath, and hit send. And in Sarasota, Florida, Betty May sat in her quiet home, the world outside already asleep. The cat purred at her feet. A mug of tea, now lukewarm, rested on the coaster. She had replayed the clip 4 times now, not because she didn't understand it, but because she did, more than she cared to admit. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the remote. Her husband had passed 5 years ago, and her political opinions had shifted slowly since, softened, opened. But she still held on to her dignity. And tonight, for the first time in years, she saw it reflected on a debate stage. She didn't shout, she whispered to herself. She didn't flinch. She asked what we all forgot to. The weight of that sentence rested over her like a warm quilt. She didn't rush to share the clip online. She didn't call anyone. She just sat with it. Not because she needed to decide what to think, but because she finally remembered how it felt to be asked something honest. Across the country, the words kept echoing, not through headlines but through hearts. And for a brief, fragile moment, the walls between sides, generations, and labels didn't fall, but they cracked. And through those cracks, something old and unfamiliar began to flicker back in. Not outrage, not certainty, but conscience. It took less than 24 hours for the backlash to begin. The clip had traveled too far, too fast. It slipped past the usual echo chambers, outpaced the talking heads, and seeped into places no one expected. Churches, barber shops, VFW halls. But J.D. Vance wasn't finished. He couldn't afford to be. He'd lost control of the stage, but he still had control of the story if he moved quickly enough. By noon the next day, he appeared on 3 conservative networks in a span of 6 hours. Hair perfectly set, tone composed but stern, he leaned into the camera and said what his base wanted to hear. "Let's be clear about what happened," he told the host of America First Live. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez didn't show empathy. She showed contempt for the law, for our borders, and frankly, for this country." The host nodded eagerly. "So you'd say her comments were un-American?" JD didn't blink. "I'd say they were exactly that." The soundbite was gold. Within minutes, headlines began to twist her question into something it never was. AOC calls border laws criminal, wants open borders for all. Ocasio-Cortez compares law enforcement to kidnappers. JD Vance stands up for America after AOC's disgraceful attack. It didn't matter that she had never said those words. It didn't matter that her entire point had been rooted in accountability, not erasure. It didn't even matter that the clip was still online, in full, uncropped. What mattered was that the machinery had been set in motion. Talk radio hosts frothed at the mouth. One called her a Trojan horse for socialism wrapped in eyeliner. Another suggested real Americans should boycott any company that platforms her voice. Comment sections overflowed with familiar venom, and by nightfall her staff began flagging emails. The first few were just the usual noise. "Go back to bartending. You hate America. We're watching you." But then came others, ones that included her home address, one that named her niece, another that said simply, "You'll pay for what you did to him." Her communications director stayed late at the office, scrolling through DMS with a clenched jaw. Her deputy chief of staff paced in silence. No one said it out loud, but they all knew what this was. The rage wasn't about a policy disagreement. It was about her refusal to shrink, her refusal to apologize for making people feel something they didn't want to feel. She had spoken plainly, and now she was being punished for it. In the days that followed, not a single senior Democrat publicly defended her. Not one. Some aides said they were monitoring the situation. Some issued neutral statements condemning all threats against public officials. But none of them touched the root. None of them said what she had said mattered. And certainly none repeated her question. AOC sat in her office late one evening as Capitol Security installed new surveillance on her front door. A staffer brought her tea she didn't touch. On her desk were 2 piles, one of hate mail, one of thank you letters. The thank you pile was taller, but the other was louder. She looked over the rim of her glasses and said quietly, "I didn't ask anything extreme." "No," her chief of staff replied. "You asked something real, and that's scarier." She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking, but she could feel the weight settle in her shoulders. She remembered something her abuela once told her, sitting on a stoop in the Bronx when she was just 13, angry at a teacher who had humiliated a classmate for mispronouncing a word. "Mia," she had said, "when you make people feel small, they get quiet. But when you make them feel seen, really seen, they either lean in or they come for you." And now they were coming. But AOC wasn't hiding. She stayed late that night, not to prepare for interviews, not to strategize talking points, but to reread the names in the thank you letters. Because if they had risked writing them, the least she could do was carry them forward. The envelope arrived without ceremony, no official markings, no return address, just a slightly crumpled white rectangle with handwriting that looked too round, too deliberate to come from an adult. It was tucked inside a larger stack of mail, most of it noise. But something about the weight of it, the way it was sealed with a single piece of Scotch tape, made AOC pause. She set aside the policy briefings and fundraising updates, held the envelope with both hands and opened it carefully. The letter inside was written in Spanish, in blue pen, with a child's uneven spacing. "Mi nombre es Mateo. Tengo 9 años. No sé dónde está mi mamá, pero espero que ella te vio cuando preguntaste esa pregunta, porque yo la oí. Y si ella también la oyó, tal vez sabrá que todavía estoy esperando. My name is Mateo. I am 9 years old. I don't know where my mom is, but I hope she saw you when you asked that question, because I heard it, and if she heard it too, maybe she'll know I'm still waiting." AOC didn't move. Her fingers rested gently on the edge of the paper. Her eyes stayed fixed, reading the lines again and again and again. She didn't cry in front of her staff, not when the headlines twisted her words, not when the threats began, not when her colleagues fell silent, but now in the quiet of her office, with the late afternoon sun slicing across the carpet and the hum of the city somewhere beyond the glass. She let the grief settle in, not just for Mateo, but for the silence that followed him, the silence he had to live in every day, the silence policy creates when it forgets who it's written for. She folded the letter slowly, then unfolded it again, smoothing the creases flat. An aide knocked gently on the door. "Congresswoman, the schedule for the floor." "Push everything back," she said without looking up, "except floor time." That evening, the House chamber was half empty, cameras off, most members absent. It was a procedural session, the kind that glides by with formality and routine. But AOC stood up anyway. She took the floor, not to make a speech, but to read a letter. She didn't preface it. She didn't announce it. She simply unfolded the page, held it gently with both hands, and began. "My name is Mateo. I am 9 years old." The chamber stilled. Those present sat a little straighter. A few turned in their chairs. One aide stopped typing. "I don't know where my mom is," she continued, "but I hope she saw you when you asked that question." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. What carried wasn't volume, but clarity. "Maybe she'll know I'm still waiting." When she finished, she folded the letter in silence. Then she said, "We argue about numbers. We fight over headlines. But this is what remains. Not slogans, not polls. A child still waiting." No applause followed, but no one interrupted. She stepped down without flourish, without eye contact. She didn't need to look back to know that every person in the room, whether they supported her or not, would carry that letter home in their memory. And somewhere across the border, or maybe a detention center, or maybe in a place without a name, a boy named Mateo might never hear about this moment. But she would carry his words with her anyway. Because when no one else listens, someone must. And sometimes that someone is simply the one who dares to read the letter out loud. The message came late, a quiet ping on her phone just after 11 p.m., long after the House floor had emptied and the Capitol had settled into its usual night hush. The name on the screen made her pause. Representative Ellison, private line. She hadn't spoken to him in months. A senior Democrat, respected, measured, the kind of lawmaker who still called reporters ma'am and filed his bills on paper before uploading them digitally. He had once told a colleague, without malice, but with certainty, that AOC was brilliant but too reactive. Another time, he'd said, "We don't need fire, we need footing." And now he was calling at midnight. She picked up. "Congresswoman," came the voice, low and gravelly. "Representative," she replied. A beat of silence passed between them. She thought maybe he'd ask about the threats. Maybe he'd offer some belated show of public support. But what he said instead caught her off guard. "You just reminded us why we came here." There was no lead-in, no hedging, just that. AOC didn't speak right away. She let the words land. Because in this building, praise often came coated in caution. But this wasn't about strategy. This was something else. "You read that letter like it was gospel," he continued. "No finger-pointing, no headlines, just truth." She thought of Mateo, of the stillness in the chamber after she finished, of the intern who stayed late just to say thank you, of the Marine who'd called his daughter, of the nurse who hit send. "I didn't think it would move anyone," she admitted. Ellison chuckled softly. "That's exactly why it did." They spoke for 7 minutes, not about polling, not about how to message the moment, but about why they had stepped into public life at all. He told her about a family he met in 1987, about the first letter he ever read into the record, and she told him about her abuela's stoop and the stories whispered on Bronx sidewalks that never made it into hearings. When they hung up, she didn't cry. She just sat quietly, her phone in one hand, Mateo's letter in the other. The next morning, something shifted. A syndicated op-ed ran in the Boston Globe. Maybe we were wrong about her. On MSNBC, a centrist anchor admitted on air, I thought she was performative, but now I wonder if it was the rest of us performing normal while she was actually responding to pain. And even in conservative spaces, cracks began to form. A right-leaning veterans nonprofit released a neutral tone statement. While we may disagree on policy, we believe no child should disappear into silence. We thank Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for reminding us of that. On Capitol Hill, the whispers softened. Where once she had been called a radical, now she was being called a reckoning. In staff meetings, aides no longer debated whether to lean into emotion. They asked how to preserve its clarity without turning it into theater. Across committee rooms, her presence no longer triggered polite sighs but lingering questions. Not because people had changed overnight, but because she hadn't changed, and yet somehow they were starting to see her differently. Real doesn't always arrive with consensus. Sometimes it arrives as a letter in a child's handwriting, folded into a silence too sharp to ignore. And when someone reads it aloud, not to win, not to perform, but to bear witness, something in the room remembers why it was built in the first place. Not to protect comfort, but to protect truth. The folding chairs had been set up hours ago, lined in neat rows that curved slightly to follow the shape of the old community gymnasium. The floor still bore faint scuff marks from last week's high school basketball game, and the overhead lights buzzed with a hum that never quite faded. In the front row sat an elderly man in a Yankees cap, a teenager with a baby sister on her lap, and a local pastor who had postponed Bible study just to be there. This wasn't a press event. No cameras, no podium, just a microphone, a circle of neighbors, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez returning home. It was the first public meeting in her district since the debate had gone viral. She arrived without fanfare, wearing jeans and a soft blazer, her hair pulled back loosely. The room greeted her not with applause but with nods, with familiarity, with the quiet kind of pride that doesn't shout, but shows up early and stays to stack chairs. A staffer handed her a folder, but she waved it off gently. She didn't need notes for this. She opened by thanking them. For showing up, for writing letters, for texting her office not to say good job, but to say, we saw you. She spoke about housing updates, local funding, transit repairs. She answered questions about school lunches and trash pickup. It felt like any other meeting, until it didn't. Near the back, a woman stood up, middle-aged, soft voice, coat still on. She didn't raise her hand first. She just stood. I don't understand all your policies, the woman said, voice a little unsteady. Sometimes I don't even know what half the bills mean. But when I watched you that night, she paused, pressing her lips together. You sounded like a mother. The room went still, not frozen, not shocked, just still. The woman glanced around like she wasn't sure if she had said the right thing. You didn't shout, she added. You didn't argue just to win. You said something that felt like someone finally remembered the child. Her voice cracked on that word. Child. AOC looked at her and didn't look away. She stepped out from behind the mic stand, took a few steps closer to the front row. Then she said simply, that's who they forgot I was. She let that line hang for a second. I'm a congresswoman, yes, but before that, I was a daughter to a mom who worked 2 jobs. I've held crying babies while their mothers filled out housing forms. I've waited in court lines with families who didn't speak English and prayed the interpreter wouldn't skip a word. I've listened to women who crossed deserts just so their kids could sleep without gunfire outside the window. She folded her hands together. That night, when I asked that question on stage, I wasn't thinking like a lawmaker. I was thinking like someone who knows what it means to lose something and not know if you'll ever get it back. She looked across the room, not at one person, but all of them. And that's who they can't silence. The woman sat down quietly. The rest of the room sat a little taller, not because they had witnessed something grand, but because they had been reminded of something true, that the voice they saw on TV was still their voice, that her mic belonged to all of them. The meeting continued, more questions, some about potholes, others about immigration reform. But the tone had changed. People weren't just there to listen. They were there to speak differently, to ask, not perform. Afterward, as AOC helped stack chairs, a young man approached her. He didn't say much, just nodded and said, "My mom watched." She cried. "We don't agree on anything, but she cried." AOC smiled. "Then we're starting somewhere." And in a city that rarely pauses, in a neighborhood where every corner holds 100 stories, a few people walked home that night with something they hadn't carried in a long time. Not policy, not certainty, but recognition. The hallway was dim, half lit by an overhead fixture that buzzed faintly, like everything in the Capitol that had seen too many arguments and not enough apologies. The building always felt different after hours. Less like a center of power, more like a monument to unfinished business. It was nearly midnight, and most of the Senate wing was empty, except for the faint click of polished shoes and the occasional shuffle of a janitor's cart. It was quiet. J.D. Vance stood alone, his back leaning gently against the cool marble wall just outside the chamber. The vote had ended an hour ago. His team had gone home, assuming he would too. But he hadn't moved. Not really. He hadn't spoken. Just stood there with his hands folded, eyes fixed on the far end of the corridor, like there was something written on the wall that only he could read. He looked tired, not in the way that camera lighting can fix, but in the way that seeps in slowly, under the collar, into the jawline, behind the eyes. For the first time in days, he wasn't rehearsing lines. He wasn't defending sound bites. He wasn't trying to win. A junior staffer appeared at the end of the hallway, walking quickly at first, then slowing when he saw JD there. Alone, still, unspeaking. The staffer hesitated, then approached carefully, holding a file but not offering it. "Senator?" he asked, voice low. JD didn't look up. The staffer shifted awkwardly. "Can I ask you something off the record?" JD finally blinked, then gave the smallest nod. Permission, or maybe indifference. The staffer glanced down the hallway, then back at him. "Do you regret it?" JD didn't answer. Not with words, but something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened, then loosened. His eyes moved slowly, toward the high ceiling, as if searching for something unspoken, maybe someone to tell him it didn't matter. But no one spoke, not even the walls. The staffer stayed quiet, unsure whether to press or to leave. After a few seconds, he said softly, "I re-watched the clip. I know we lost control of the room, but," he paused, choosing his words, "I just wondered if you thought, maybe she was right, not in politics, but in the question." JD turned his face slightly, just enough for the light to catch the crease above his brow. He still didn't speak, but his silence no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like wait. The staffer waited, then gave up waiting. "I'll walk you out," he said quietly. JD shook his head once. "No," he said finally, voice low, rough. "I'll stay." The young man hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps echoing back for a few seconds before fading. JD stood there a few minutes longer, alone again. He looked at the floor, then at the empty chamber door, then back at the floor. And when he finally moved, it was without drama. Just the slow steps of a man walking away from something he no longer knew how to defend. The next morning, no statement was made, no press release issued, no apology given. But during a Senate vote on a family reunification amendment, a small provision attached to a larger immigration package, J.D. Vance surprised everyone. He abstained. No vote, no explanation. Just a blank space where his name was expected to land. The room noticed. His party noticed. Reporters noticed. But no one asked why. Because sometimes in Washington, silence doesn't mean weakness. It means something else entirely. In the days that followed, the political shows did what they always did. Panels of experts argued about polling trends, fundraising bumps, whether AOC's moment would sustain or fade. They played the clip in split screen, sliced it into segments, debated whether the question was too emotional or politically strategic. Charts were shown, arrows moved. Words like optics and narrative velocity filled the air, but none of them could quite explain what had actually happened, because something had shifted, and not in a way polls were designed to measure. In Ohio, Frank, the retired Marine, signed up to volunteer for a local charity that supported refugee families. It wasn't a grand gesture. He just showed up, brought coffee, helped translate forms. He told his daughter later, "I don't know if I changed my mind, but I know I couldn't look away anymore." In Florida, Betty May took the small pension check she usually split between groceries and church donations and sent $20 to a shelter she'd found online. She included a note in the envelope, "For the ones still waiting." God bless in El Paso, Anna kept writing letters. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 other nurses joined her. One of them admitted, "I didn't know how to put it into words until she asked that question." The experts kept circling the numbers, pointing at graphs, but the truth had already left the studio. It was living in a retired man's hands, a grandmother's envelope, a nurse's second draft. Because in a country drowning in noise, one sentence hadn't just made people listen, it made them feel. And when people feel again, they don't return to the same place they stood before. They carry something forward, even if they don't have words for it yet. The studio was smaller than usual. No bright lights, no countdown clock, just a soft blue backdrop and 2 chairs positioned close enough for a real conversation. The show was late night, public access, quiet by design. No audience, no spin. The kind of program that most politicians skipped, unless they had something they actually wanted to say. AOC sat with her hands folded lightly in her lap, sleeves pushed up just past her wrists. No statement jewelry, no teleprompter. Just her and the host, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a voice that never rose above calm curiosity. "It's been 3 weeks," the host said, "since that debate night." AOC nodded once. "You've been called everything from the conscience of Congress to a dangerous emotional manipulator. You've started conversations in living rooms, in state houses, even in places that normally don't listen to politics at all." She paused, then leaned in slightly. "What do you think people actually remember?" AOC didn't answer right away. She took a slow breath, eyes lowered, not in hesitation, but in thought. Then she looked up, steady and unhurried. "Not the stats," she said. "Not the noise." A pause. "Just the silence, right before the truth." The host blinked, caught off guard not by the words but by the quiet certainty behind them. AOC continued, her voice soft but unshakable. "There's a moment right before you say something that matters, when the world holds its breath. That's the part we skip past in politics. We're taught to fill space, to speak first, to out-volume each other. But that night I remembered something my grandmother once said to me. Sometimes silence is the only thing loud enough to be heard by a heart that's closed." She shifted slightly in her chair. "I didn't plan that question. I didn't rehearse it. It wasn't in my notes. It was just there. And I waited, because I needed people to feel the weight before I gave them the words." The host tilted her head. "And what about the reaction since?" AOC offered a half smile. "Some people got angry, some people got quiet, but the most surprising ones? They were the ones who reached out to say they hadn't cried in years, and that something about that silence reminded them of what they used to believe." She glanced down for a moment, then back at the host. "I don't know if it changed policy, but I know it changed something, even if it's just how we listen to one another." The host didn't rush the next question. She simply nodded and let the stillness do its work. Across the country, those who watched that interview didn't rewind for the sound bites. They rewound for the silence. It didn't make headlines. No grand announcement, no press conference with waving hands or thunderous applause. Just a quiet line of text added to the legislative calendar, H.R. 8342, Family Reunification Protocols, introduced by a small bipartisan group, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, and an independent from the border states. It wasn't sweeping reform, no dramatic overhaul, but for the first time in years, the language was different. It acknowledged children by name, not as minors. It included time limits for separation, transparency for transfers, required notification of guardians. It included a clause about trauma-informed care. And buried deep in the summary was a phrase that hadn't appeared in legislation before. In the spirit of preventing irreversible familial harm. No one mentioned the debate. No one credited the question. And AOC didn't ask them to. She read the bill alone in her office one evening, her feet kicked off, highlighter in hand. When she reached the clause on notification protocols, she paused. She remembered Mateo's letter, folded it once more in her memory. Then she picked up her phone, dialed her staff lead on immigration, and said, "Track this." Quietly. "Let me know when it moves." And it did move. Through subcommittees. Through the late-night markup sessions where most things go to die. But this time, it passed forward. Barely, but forward. Outside the Capitol, community shelters noticed the shift. Caseworkers who had operated on scraps of information now received printed records. Lawyers began receiving reunification orders not as rumors, but as PDFs. And one mother, who hadn't seen her child in 9 months, was finally granted access to a facility she hadn't even known existed. No cable network linked the moment back to AOC. And that was fine, because what mattered had never been the spotlight. It was the movement in the shadow, the policies that creaked forward not because someone shouted, but because someone asked the right question at the right time and left the echo behind long enough for others to walk toward it. In a quiet moment, one of her senior staffers asked, "Do you ever feel like you should remind people it started with you?" AOC shook her head. "If it helps a mother hold her child," she said, "it can belong to whoever needs it to." And so it went. No awards, no coverage, just progress. One clause at a time. The marble steps of the Capitol gleamed under a soft dusk sky, the kind of golden hour that made the dome look less like power and more like memory. AOC stepped through the tall doors alone. No staff, no cameras, just the quiet shuffle of her heels against the granite. She didn't rush. She carried no folder, no phone, only a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket, a copy of the boy's letter from the border. The ink had smudged slightly from the day she held it too long. As she descended the steps, tourists nearby glanced at her, but no one interrupted. Perhaps they sensed the moment didn't belong to interruption. Perhaps they simply understood. Sometimes a story finishes not with a bang, but with a breath. Her voice came as a soft voiceover, not declarative, not theatrical, just honest. We live in a country where sometimes the truth must whisper to be heard, but when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to scream. It just needs to ask the right question. Cut to black, but not abrupt, just a gentle fade, like the end of a song that lingers in the chest. Then, on the screen, quiet white letters appeared. Policy or crime? You decide. No dramatic music, just a hush. The kind that comes after someone says something real and leaves the room before applause can decide what to feel. And for a moment, across homes and buses and waiting rooms and break rooms all over America, people stopped scrolling. Because for once, the question wasn't yelling at them. It was asking them. And it felt like something that mattered. Something no algorithm could explain. Something a poll couldn't measure. A pause that stayed. A silence that spoke. And a walkout that didn't end the story, but gave it back to the people to finish. This story reminds us that real change often happens in silence, away from cameras, applause, or credit. AOC didn't fight for a headline. She fought for humanity. When others chose noise, she chose a question. And that question didn't just echo. It moved people, policies, and perspectives. It shows that leadership isn't about domination. It's about dignity, about asking what we stopped asking. In a world obsessed with who gets the spotlight, this reminds us, it's what happens in the shadow that shapes the light. What's one moment in your life when silence spoke louder than words? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.